Welcome, everyone, to the Live Ultralight podcast powered by Outdoor Vitals. This podcast is all about inspiring you to get outdoors, showing you how to lighten your pack and build your confidence so that you can start living your life full of adventure. I am Joe.
I'm Tayson.
Brigham.
And we're going to be talking about altitude today. Specifically how to deal with altitude. As a backpacker, as a hiker. First, Tayson, could you tell us why is this important?
Yeah, I think for a lot of years I've heard things about altitude sickness, and I was just thinking Everest. You know, guys that are hiking these crazy tall peaks. Growing up in Utah, like I just didn't think much about high elevation, and so that was like, I don't know. My background was just like, until I go hike something like that, I don't care. We even had someone on really early on the podcast where we talked about elevation on Denali and altitude sickness, but it was like, till I go to Denali, it doesn't matter. But anyways, as we got into this, I guess I started to find times where it really, really did matter. So anyways, today we're just going to be talking all about altitude sickness, and why it does matter to people is really high altitude can be as low as 8,000 feet in elevation. That to me was like low. Coming from Utah, I thought altitude, like high altitude, might start at like 10,000 feet, but according to medical professionals and stuff, sometimes they'll categorize stuff as low as 8,000 feet into high altitude. So you may or may not be encountering this. You may or may not be a healthy, strong person, which is another thing that I thought was that by being younger, healthier, that I would avoid it. That's also not true. So anyone and everyone could get altitude sickness, and you don't have to be going to Everest for this to matter to you. And this last year kind of proved it for me, where I had my own experience with getting altitude sickness and kind of put me on the topic of researching and caring about it finally.
I think I've dealt with altitude sickness before. Both times where I tried to summit and failed to summit Kings Peak and Mount Elbert in Colorado, both of which are known as like generally easier kind of high elevation climbs. Both times I was about a quarter mile away from the top, and I got like really sick and just all these sort of like just sick and weak and horrible feeling. And I turned around on both of them. My tail tucked in between my legs on both of those hikes.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I did Kings Peak, well, the only time I've ever done Kings Peak. So that's only a 13,500 foot peak. And I did it, but I felt like trash, and I wasn't sure. You know, that's the thing is, like, a lot of times you're like, I'm not sure if this is elevation sickness. I'm not sure, right? Like, that's like the most common theme. When I had elevation sickness, I didn't believe it was elevation sickness both times, and so it sneaks up on a lot of people. So having a good knowledge base on it, I think, is helpful. And there's probably a good time for me to also say, none of us on here are doctors. None of us on here have any room to speak on this topic whatsoever. This will be entertaining. Hopefully you will get some stories out of our case studies and our experiences with this, but we're not medical professionals. So
that's true. I think also like you mentioned just a second ago, I think altitude sickness is one of those things that it really is hard to tell if what you're experiencing or feeling is actually altitude sickness. One, you're probably not hiking with your pulmonologist next to you who's got you connected to sensors and testing your blood oxygen and testing what's going on in your lungs and your brain. So you really don't have like a qualified person to tell you if it is or isn't altitude sickness. There's other things that happen when you, for example, like climb to the top of a tall mountain, right? That you can experience some things that could be altitude sickness or could just be fitness related or altitude related, because at altitude the air pressure is significantly lower, so less oxygen gets into your lungs. That's not altitude sickness. So like there's some distinctions that really, I think that's the challenge with altitude sickness and why it sneaks up on people and kind of why it matters. It's like the biggest thing I think is just like knowing what to look for and like how to recognize what could be altitude sickness, because it's like, do you really want to mess around too much? If you're having things that feel like it could be altitude sickness, then probably the smart thing is to address them as if it is, because why not, right?
Okay. Well, do we want to go into recognizing altitude sickness? Are you guys prepared to go into that?
There's there's all kinds of ways we could talk.
Yeah, we could talk about different types of altitude sicknesses. We could talk about. I mean, in the end, I think what we want to do is give people, actionable information, hopefully that will help them prepare for altitude sickness.
Okay.
Along with the stories we'll tell and whatnot, but maybe let's just briefly touch on just what altitude sickness is and some of that. So there's 3 types of altitude sickness. There's acute mountain sickness, which is the most common by far. That's the headaches, dizzy, nausea, muscle aches type of experiences, right? Then you've got high altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE. So that's basically your lungs are filling up with fluid. Symptoms of that would be like if you're coughing a lot, maybe coughing up blood, things like that. But that's a very low percentage thing. And then high altitude cerebral edema, which is HACE with the C. That's kind of the acronym. And that's fluid in the brain. So both HAPE and HACE are much lower probabilities to experience. So for the most part, we're going to be mainly talking about AMS, or acute mountain sickness.
Yeah. And it's important to note, though, HAPE and HACE are very low probability of happening. They are life-threatening. They're not like something that you don't sit there and wait it out. You don't think you're going to get better. If you actually have the symptoms that are related to either of those, you need to take immediate action, because they will both kill you. That sounds extreme, but it is extreme, but also extremely unlikely. But it would be foolish to discard the fact that they are life-threatening conditions. But yeah.
So got that out of the way. Where do we want to go from here?
Well, so I think it's important it would be helpful for people that maybe aren't familiar with, like you talked about in the kind of early on when we first started, like the 8,000 foot altitude, that's pretty widely accepted as like kind of the first real benchmark of altitude where you're going to start experiencing altitude sickness symptoms. So also put the disclaimer out there that like 8,000 feet, that doesn't mean that we're saying that if you're at 7,900 feet that there's no possible way that you're going to experience symptoms.
Right.
But there's general benchmarks of 2,000 feet. So like 8,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 12,000 feet. As you surpass those benchmarks, the likelihood of getting altitude sickness increases, and the effects of altitude on the body significantly increase kind of at those 2,000 foot increments.
Yeah. So maybe let's just start off with my story of getting altitude sickness. And I think people can learn a lot from it, because I definitely learned a lot with it. So this summer we were doing a fast pack, which is basically using a different type of backpacking pack, putting it all on your back, and then running and jogging instead of just hiking. So we were doing a lot of training for this. If you followed us before, you've heard us talk a lot about this. But as we set out, we had decided we wanted to run basically over the top of a very tall mountain range here in southern Utah, and go basically highway to highway. And so we started off on this thing, and on day one, we ran/hiked 26.5 miles and climbed 6,000 feet of elevation. And I felt fine like the whole day. There was a moment where I got a little bit behind on hydration. I was kind of nervous about it, and started drinking a lot of water and whatnot. But like when we got into camp, I was still I felt like just as good as anyone else looking around camp. At night, we had dinner, we did a podcast even, and then I went to bed, and I woke up like an hour later just sick. I thought I was going to throw up. And the rest of that night, about every half an hour to an hour, I'd wake up, feel like I was going to throw up, and just over and over. And I think I might have had a spell where I got almost a couple hours of like straight sleeping. And I woke up like that next morning just thinking like, oh, okay, please be gone, because I've still got, I don't know, 50 miles or something like that, or maybe a little less, 40 miles of this fast pack to do, and I was still sick. So anyways, I ended up going through that entire trip feeling super sick. The next couple of days, I really couldn't eat. I was so nauseous, just low energy, headaches kind of came off and on, but just really nauseous. And the whole time, I'm just spinning in my head thinking, like, what the heck is this? Like, is it altitude sickness? Is it not? Well, I don't really have a headache, so it's probably not. And then this and this. And then got off the entire trail, and, after having eaten almost nothing for 2 days, almost immediately started to feel better. We went into a Subway. That's like the food I was craving, was like a sandwich with a bunch of mayonnaise on it for some reason. And which is why I started bringing mayonnaise packets on the trail sometimes. But anyways, started to feel better pretty dang fast, and then ate like 5 meals worth of food in like the next 6 hours. Like, seriously. Like, anyways, but then I talked to my brother, and he's like, "Oh yeah, we were sick last week. Like, I was feeling nauseous too, and there was this," and I was like, "So did I have nausea?" I didn't know. I really didn't know. So then we go on Highline, and we have another scenario where a different team member of ours experiences symptoms again. And I won't cover those details right now. And he actually had to get off the trail because he was too sick to go on. And then months later, I'm literally listening to this college professor, doctor on YouTube talk about elevation sickness. And I just started piecing things together. And I thought, man, maybe I really did have elevation sickness. And I just didn't want to admit it or face it or whatever it was. And I thought, there's something that I could check that seems to be a symptom that these guys are talking about, which is like elevated heart rate. And so I went back using my trusty Garmin watch and their platform, and I looked at my heart rate that night, and I saw that my resting heart rate, which is usually in the mid to low 40s when I sleep, was at 80 beats per minute. Did not go under 82 beats per minute that whole entire night. And that was kind of a start of like me being like, that was elevation sickness. And then I started to research more and just putting more and more dots together. And sure enough, I firmly believe that I had elevation sickness that day and that entire trip. So it basically kind of ruined that trip for me. I was able to complete, even though it probably wasn't the smartest thing in retrospect. But it was really interesting to me, I guess, of like starting to put everything together and factors that could have led to that. So, after that, die hard on it. And I think maybe now let's go backwards and talk about why I think it was elevation sickness and the factors that you need to watch out for, right? So on that day one, actually before we ever got there, one of the ways that you can avoid elevation sickness is getting good sleep, not having any underlying sicknesses, and getting good sleep multiple days before you go to high elevation. Brigham, you always talk about stress on the body, right? Like limiting the amount of stress on the body. Well, that was like the opposite of what we did, right? I got terrible sleep. I got like 5 or 6 hours. I was up packing my bag super late, had a bunch of stuff going on for me that kind of made me procrastinate per se, getting totally ready. Then I got really poor sleep. We were up at like 5 something in the morning to get to the trailhead, drive out there, and then we put a 20-pound pack on our back and start running for 26 miles, which I've never done in my life. That was my first, marathon per se in a day. And then, keep in mind 20-pound pack. And then we climbed 6,000 feet of elevation. And then this is the part too that was funny is, listening to some of these people talk about high elevation is, to me, high elevation is 10,000 feet plus. Our camp that night was like 9,900, you know what I mean? But looking around, it didn't look like 10,000 feet to me. A lot of times when you get to 10,000 feet, you are seeing the transition between trees to non-trees or stuff like that. But it didn't look like that at all. It was heavily treed, etc. And so we we climbed 6,000 feet that day. So tons of stress on the body, and then sleeping at that high of elevation. Also looking backwards, I think one thing that I did that hurt me was getting slightly behind on hydration, then trying to play catch up. I think I threw off a lot of my electrolytes in my body because I overhydrated without keeping a good ratio of electrolytes. Anyways, all of those I think equated to me getting elevation sickness. And I I don't know. I think there's some good takeaways there.
I think so too. Go ahead, Joe.
I was about to say, like, the common thing that you hear is to sleep at elevation for a few days before you even start hiking. I don't know how many people actually have time for something like that.
That's the problem.
That's a challenge. That's a challenge.
I also moved to Vail, Colorado for a few months, and it took me, like, I would say almost 3 months where I wasn't winded when I picked up a box. Like, so I feel like when they say, because I did research on that, it was like, 10 days or something like that, 3 to 10 days to get used to elevation. I think it's way more than that. At least it is for me.
Yeah.
To just living up at like 8,300 feet was quite taxing.
I think there's different levels of acclimating, but yeah, it can take you 3 months to fully acclimate. But I think you can do you get a lot of your gains in the first couple days per se.
Because I think there's a couple things going on where there's full acclimation, like as if you're permanently staying there. Mm-hmm. Like your body adjusts to the altitude in day-to-day life versus like acclimatizing enough to reduce the chance of getting altitude sickness. Like they're kind of they're related but separate issues, right?
Okay.
So I don't know. I think also, we could talk about what are the factors that contribute or increase the likelihood of getting altitude sickness. And then I have that experience too that we could hash out.
Let's just cover what are they typically. Like we've kind of seen a case study of what gave me altitude sickness. So just calling out what those things are exactly.
Yeah, so obviously the first one would be the elevation benchmarks. So like we talked about, around 8,000 feet, as you increase that altitude, your likelihood increases.
Kind of exponentially too,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. That's a good point. And then rate of ascent is one of the most significant factors in getting altitude sickness. So that's, how quickly did you go from a non-threatening altitude to an altitude where you have an increased likelihood of altitude sickness. How quickly did you do that? And then another significant factor is stress on the body, and that branches out. That's a big umbrella topic, stress on the body. So that includes exertion, that includes sleep or rest prior to the event. So how stressed was your body days before you ascended, right? So, and that is affected by sleep. That's affected by physical exertion. Did you run 10 miles 2 days before you ascended 6,000 feet? So there's the stress on the body prior to the event. There's the exertion as you're ascending and as you're at the altitude. There's the rate of ascent. And then there's the altitude, and then hydration, that's stress on the body. So lack of hydration is stress on the body. Lack of poor nutrition is stress on the body. Lack of electrolytes, that's stress on the body. And then the difficulty of the activity that you're doing, that's stress on the body. And then I just lost it, but basically, how the duration that you're exerting yourself at altitude, and then
recovery time,
if you're just going and you're never taking the time to rest, those are all very as you add those factors in, the likelihood of you getting altitude sickness just goes up.
I'm not saying it is or isn't altitude sickness, but what I dealt with at Kings Peak and Mount Albert, 14,000, 13,000 feet.
Well,
it was immediately better as soon as I started walking up the hill.
I remembered the
your
other
exertion
thing.
level goes down and you're losing elevation.
Yeah, and that reminds the other thing is fitness level. Okay. So and that's where it gets tricky, is because you can take a very unfit person and they could try and go hike Kings Peak and feel absolutely hammered, but they could very easily not be having altitude sickness. They could just be a person that's very out of shape, and now there's a massive percentage less oxygen getting into their lungs because of the altitude, and they feel like crap. That's not the same as altitude sickness. That's lack of fitness, and that's the altitude taking an effect on your performance. But
Well,
but it also can, if you are out of shape, you're more likely to get altitude sickness at those altitudes and with all those other factors.
Yeah, I think I would want to interject here because in some of the research I've done, some people are trying to claim that fitness levels don't affect altitude sickness, or even that healthy people are more at risk. But as I dove more into the research, it's not that healthy people are more at risk percentage-wise. They're more at risk because they're more likely to put high stress on their bodies, meaning they come in headstrong and they think, kind of like I probably have done a lot of times where it's like, hey, I'm in pretty dang good shape this year. Like, I'm invincible. I'm just going to go up there and I'm going to run a marathon at 10,000 feet in elevation, right?
Yeah, versus going
and
for
so
like
they put
a 2 mile little hike.
Yeah. They put themselves at risk. But my belief is definitely in the ballpark of being more in shape helps you, but doesn't make you invincible. Like, don't think of it that way at all. So, yeah, there's some different trains of thoughts there for sure.
Well, let's get into what from your guys' research helps with altitude sickness then.
Yeah. Well, I'll let Brigham start this off, but I do want to just say I feel like for me, I have found what I think I used to think was like the culprit, but I think it's more like a trailing indicator using heart rate. So I do want to get into that because I think that's an indicator you can use in live time that's really, really interesting to look at. But yeah, so what helps? Is that what you wanted to go back to? Is what helps with elevation sickness?
Yeah.
I think it's all the things you've already talked about.
Yeah, so like basically all those factors, you try to mitigate them. You try to account for as many factors as you can. So like think of it as a risk assessment. What are the risks? How are we going to mitigate all those risks? Because you're not going to eliminate them, right? So everything we just talked about, you want to mitigate. So, and it does get challenging because people have work, they have family lives. So it's like things like, well, it'd be great to get 10 hours of sleep 4 days, leading up to each day leading up to the trip, right? But that's very difficult. And my story relates to that. But then, being properly hydrated, just being conscious, basically thinking ahead. So at least try and get a good night's sleep the day before. And what I often try to do is at least maybe sleep at the trailhead the night before. So that helps kind of get a little bit adjusted. And then versus driving to the trailhead, that's a quick rate of ascent. And then exerting myself up another several thousand feet, right? So just things like that and then properly making sure you're hydrating your body as best as possible as you are ascending and exerting yourself and making sure you're keeping track of, regularly ingesting, electrolytes to replace everything you're losing, because you're losing way more than you can actually put in your body.
People never realize how much they're getting dehydrated at high elevation because there's two factors up there that
it's cold.
Well, it's not even that. It's that, yeah, it is cold, so you don't feel hot ever.
Yeah.
It's always windy, and it's usually a very dry wind up there. So it's just pulling all of your sweat off your body so quickly you don't even realize you're sweating half the time. And then you're in like super direct sunlight, typically. And so you've got more exposure to sun because you're higher up. There's less ozone. You can get more sunburn, right? But what that equates to, from my own experience out there, is that people are like, I've been drinking plenty of water. I don't, and they don't realize like they're not dehydrating at an average level. They're dehydrating at like a very, very high level. And they really are getting dehydrated without ever knowing it, because the typical signs you look for is, oh, my shirt's getting sweaty, or, oh, just whatever it is, or like my forehead's getting wet. Well, your forehead's never going to be wet because it's getting blasted by the sun and there's this constant wind at elevation, right? So I think those factors lead people to not always realize how much they're dehydrating out there.
Yeah, I totally agree. We should do like a separate podcast on hydration, because it's another one of those things where people just really don't know what's actually happening. If I'm not thirsty, so why would I drink? Or I'm not sweating, why would I drink water anyway?
Both of those hikes, I had ran out of water by the time we got back to my camp, by the way.
Yeah.
So I was drinking a lot, but I don't think I would have had enough to push it forward like that.
Right.
Yeah. So what's your story, Brigham?
This was probably 2 years ago, around 2019. So I had a trip planned where I was going to backpack, starting kind of at a low level trailhead that was at like 5,000 feet, and then backpack up in 4 miles to 9,500 feet, and just spend my time up at that level for like 3 days, like 3 nights. But prior to this trip, knowing that this was like right after an upcoming 3-day weekend, and so prior to this 3-day weekend, I was trying to cram in a ton of hours to get all the work that needed to be done to be able to.
Was this recently?
Yeah, it was like 2 years ago.
Okay, I remember this now.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a second. Okay.
Yeah, it was Labor Day. It was Labor Day weekend. So, basically, I was basically working 12 hours a day for a week leading up to the 3-day weekend, so that I could kind of just get work done and then build up time, so I wasn't having to use like vacation time and didn't have to worry about losing any paycheck or any of that, And so then I did, and I was actually meeting my family out of town. So like that last 12-day workday that I worked, I then drove. I went home, packed up my stuff for that trip and the next trip, and then drove, at like midnight for a couple hours, met my family, and then did the Labor Day vacation, which was, just chasing kids, and it was down south of here, so it was 105 degrees, and not really been able to do the best things for my body for 3 days or whatever. And then, so I also, in between that trip and the next trip, I wanted to work like a day. So I got up at like 4 a.m. from the trip, from where we were staying, and drove here to the office so I could get in a 12-hour workday. And then at the end of that day, I drove up north to where I was going on my trip. And so, needless to say, there's like 4 nights or so of like very little sleep, but leading up to that, multiple like long days, and then trying to get all the, life, home stuff taken care of, in 2 or 3 nights to get ready for these trips. And then, so I come and I work that day, and then I drive about 5 hours north, in the middle of the night, and then get up that next morning with 3 hours of sleep at like 4:30 in the morning at the trailhead, and I hiked up. Well, by the time it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd gotten up to about 9,500 feet, found where I was going to set up camp. But by the time I got to that point, I'd been up there for like 2-3 hours, and I just started feeling like this massive headache, tons of fatigue, just like this really heavy-headed feeling, and just like I was way past, dehydrated. I couldn't keep up with my hydration. And like, granted, like I know about all these things, right? So like, but I was just trying to force it, right? I was just trying to, committed to, I'd taken the time off work. I was committed to doing this. And anyway, so by like 3-4 in the afternoon, man, I was just smoked, like just completely beat. I felt horrible. I was dizzy, weak. My legs were weak. Just very fatigued. My head was just pounding, and it was affecting my vision. And so, I had service at the top of the mountain. And so I ended up texting my wife and just saying like, I feel horrible. I'm worried if I stay up here, it's just going to get worse. So I bailed off the mountain. So I came down. Well, my wife, I guess, said, she was worried about it, so she didn't want to say anything to me. So apparently she texted my parents that live close by that town. And anyway, so they got all worried. But I mean, I was in bad shape. So that whole way down, I was just so, my body, I just felt so horrible that like, by the time I got down to that like 5,500 foot of elevation towards the trailhead, that last like 1 to 2 miles, basically flat, like, it like took everything I had to make it to my truck. And it was really bad. Like I don't think I've ever felt that like sick and fatigued physically. Anyway, so my dad, he's a retired doctor, and he's not a pulmonologist or anything, but generally I think most doctors have an awareness of how the body works, and so he was asking me questions about it, and he kind of thought that, like, yeah, I think you've got some altitude sickness, and I over the next day, 2 days, like, it was, it's just like one of those things where it all comes together. It all really pieces together because in the moment, your cognitive ability is really not great. So you're really not putting the pieces together other than, I want to stick this out and I don't want to leave, but I physically can't keep going. So, but like, yeah, I mean, within a day or two, once my head got clear, it was very clear. Like, again, I didn't go visit a pulmonologist or anything, but for sure, like I'm certain that was altitude sickness, and because it just checks all the boxes. I mean, so leading up to it, I hardly slept, worked long days, the few days prior, and then got no sleep before going up, close to 5,000 feet of elevation in a short distance. And so, yeah, like in that case, like I did all the things wrong. Like I did as many things wrong as I could, honestly. So, yeah.
Well, as far as how to avoid it, how to mitigate those things, I mean, what would be your advice to me? Let's say we were all to do Highline or something like that, and I were to go with you guys. Mm-hmm. What would you tell me to do?
Yeah. I think just like Brigham said, prep starts days before. So, getting good rest before, first couple days before is a big factor. When you're there, making sure you're getting really good, just consistent hydration. I think it also is just really helpful to know your limits and know when you're pushing past them. And if you are, being able to tell your group or yourself, hey, I need to slow down because I'm stressing my body too much, per se. So let me kind of back up. Actually, I want to talk about heart rate for a second because I think that can be a really valuable thing for people, and more people have heart rate monitors on them these days, right? Through watches. If you have an Apple Watch, you could get your heart rate, and more of them also have blood oxygen sensors, which is another thing that I actually did not use my blood oxygen sensor on this Garmin because I found it kind of finicky. I learned in November, though, that it works. I just wasn't being patient enough, I guess you could say. So I didn't actually pull any of that kind of stats throughout it. But one thing that I feel like I noticed was a big factor for me was just overall heart rate. And I think that can help you in the moment as well as looking back. But so, like I mentioned, with my heart rate being super high on the Beaver, not dropping below 80 beats per minute when I was sleeping and trying to rest. The next month later, I went to another area where I was even higher. I barely stepped below 12,000 feet of elevation for like a week. I was at that kind of high elevation. And what's interesting there is I'm getting more data sets with that heart rate. And what I found there is I had, to that one, an underlying sickness. I wasn't sick, but I couldn't breathe through my nose very well because it was still like stuffy from being sick before that. And between that and Colorado, when I was at Colorado, we also went on Highline. So I had 3 different trips where I was at elevation, and I was able to monitor heart rate. And when I went on Highline, same thing. Heart rate's in the 70s night 1, 70s night 2, gets into the 50s night 3. And I felt pretty dang good. By night 3, I was feeling like really good on that trip. There was like 1 or 2 moments where I like started to develop a headache, and I was able to, I think, kind of basically I took like a quick lunch, laid down, got like a tiny little nap, was trying to stay really hydrated, was able to bounce back from it really well. But by like night 3, heart rate was getting really low during resting periods and did really well. The rest of that trip didn't feel any high elevation. When I went to Colorado and was at over 12,000 feet for a long period of time, I had that ability. I couldn't breathe through my nose. And I found a big difference in me being able to breathe through my nose and lowering my heart rate. And so it actually took me 4+ days to get my resting heart rate into the 50s even. I was having a lot of 70s, then got into the 60s for a couple days. And then finally, when my nose cleared up, was I finally able to get into the 50s. So I guess why is this all relevant is I think what I've experienced and learned and come full circle on this is that heart rate is a really good indicator of stress on the body. So, and let me display that in a few ways. Let's say, for instance, we talked about getting good rest a few days before. Well, let's say you weren't getting good rest. Let's say you were, like Brigham said, you went on a 10-mile run the day before and you put all that stress on your body. Well, what does that do? Even after that workout is over, your body has to rebuild muscle tissues. It has to regenerate. It has to do all those things, which is stress on the body and actually elevates your heart rate. So a lot of times you can see your heart rate resting after something like that will stay a little bit higher on a resting heart rate than if you did no physical activity. So I like one indicator, right? Hydration. You can actually go in, and I've tested this a lot. I've heard experts talk about this with the Garmin devices as well, is if you are dehydrated, you can see that in your heart rate, right? Because your body has to pump harder essentially to circulate and to fuel everything than if you are well hydrated. So if I go into a run dehydrated, and I know I'm dehydrated, my average heart rate on that run will be 10 to 20 beats per minute faster. And so that's a factor, right? That's how hydration plays into this. Anyways, there's all these different touch points that I've kind of found that heart rate can be a decent indicator. Again, I'm not a doctor. This has just been my experience this last year, tracking it, monitoring it. It can be a good indicator of, are you stressing yourself too much in the moment? So say in the moment, I know that, I should be staying below 150 beats per minute, or I get into, anaerobic, right? State, right? So even at high elevation, like if I'm tracking that, I'm like, hey, I don't want to push too hard and get my heart rate into the 160s, 170s, 180s. That's going to be helpful down the road with elevation. But then also, even just factors to me like staying well hydrated, you can kind of track that. Like my heart rate's rising more than it usually is. Maybe I'm getting dehydrated. And when you go to sleep, if you get done with one night of sleep up there and you see like, man, my heart rate didn't really go down low. That's a good indicator that don't push it. You know what I mean? Maybe don't push yourself, because I think all of that really plays in. I will say the best ways that one of the things that I've really become a big believer in is breathing through your nose. If you can do that, I think that's a big helpful thing. Like, so when I sleep, I've kind of also been watching myself with this. If I sleep and my nose is clogged, I lose so much more water throughout the night that I can almost never be hydrated the next morning. When I was on Colorado, I had that plugged nose. I could not breathe through my nose at nighttime. And I was doing everything I could to hydrate. I'd drink a bunch of water right before bedtime. I would drink throughout the night anytime I woke up, and I would still wake up and be slightly on the dehydrated side of things, which I thought was very interesting, but I couldn't breathe through my nose. So there's little things like this that I think you can learn from this. So nasal breathing, but also just using it as it's kind of a trailing indicator more than a leading indicator per se, meaning like you can't watch this and be like, yep, like clockwork, I'm going to get elevation sickness. But it's like, it can be helpful data sets to learn and experience. And it's another one of those reasons, though, that it's super helpful for me, I think, to wear the Garmin devices or any device that you can build that kind of a profile, because I can go months back. I was just looking at it before we hopped on the podcast. I went back to those days in July and August and September looking at my heart rates and just analyzing it, and it helps you build, I think, your own profile to learn from. But I think to me, that's been a very interesting thing. And it's something that I'll report on, because this year I've got a handful of other trips that I'm planning to do at high elevation. In fact, I'm planning to do another big run at high elevation. And that's going to be one of the biggest things I'm going to watch and try to control and see if that ends up really paying off for me. But
okay.
Anyways, that's my
any other things before you tell me how to deal with this?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's all we're doing is telling you how to deal with it.
Okay, so I feel like you're probing for some generalities and tips.
Yeah,
so
I am probing for that.
Let's do something like that. So
quick like top 5 things you can do.
So like try and be well rested prior to your trip. Pay attention to your exertion level as you're ascending or as you're doing whatever you're doing to the altitude or at the altitude. try to be as fit as you possibly can before you ever do this trip. Make sure you're hydrating properly and fueling your body properly. That includes food and things like electrolytes. So pay attention to your rate of ascent. If your trip just says, well, I'm hiking from point A to point B, and point B is at this altitude, well, we're not saying don't do your trip, right? Just try and mitigate all the other factors like I talked about. Prior to it, be well rested, be as healthy and fit as you can, be well hydrated prior to your trip, and hydrate well during your trip, and try to, listen to your body. If the tool Tayson was just talking about, that's a great tool. If you don't, just pay attention to your body. If you feel like if you just can't even keep up with your breath, you're killing yourself, well, slow way down. Stop and take a 30-minute break. So that's kind of like addressing the rate of ascent. And then the other thing is also, if you can, I think it's very helpful to try to sleep a night before at the trailhead. And that only helps if the trailhead is at a higher elevation than your home. So like that trailhead that I started at, it's not. That's what we live at, right? So, but the High Line, we slept at like 9,000 feet. That's helpful. That's definitely helpful. So if you can do that,
but get good rest too.
But
don't drive to the trailhead and get 6 hours of rest just to be at it. Like I would say, what's your opinion on this? I'll say mine after yours, but if it's a decision between getting 6 hours of sleep at elevation or 8 hours of sleep in your bed at a slightly lower elevation, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a tough one. 6 hours or 8 hours, those are kind of close. But if you're talking I'll throw in another factor. 6 hours at elevation when you've driven 5 hours through the night, and then you sleep in your car very uncomfortably, where you're like your neck's sore, and those are 6 crappy hours of sleep. I would definitely take just getting a good solid night's sleep in a comfortable bed, having taken all the other measures prior to that, and then just mitigate as many other factors as I can.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is I think a lot of times you kind of blitz to a trailhead and then get crappy sleep. So if you don't sleep well, you need to figure out your sleeping pad, shelter, whatever situation, so you do sleep well. But there's people that don't, maybe just aren't very attuned to sleeping in the backcountry, and they might still get to the trailhead, might still get what they think is a lot of hours of sleep, but maybe it's not quality enough. There's things you can mitigate for that for sure. But I'm probably more on the train of get good quality sleep is just as important as sleeping at the elevation. So there's two things to weigh there. I have some other questions that I want to dive into.
Go ahead.
So on Highline, we had Brennan get sick. And Brennan's not here, which is great because we can pick on him. Brennan, if you're listening, we love you. You know that. Brennan, so we started Highline just like Brigham said. We slept at 9,000 feet of elevation at the trailhead, started hiking the next day, and basically by a little after lunchtime, was it?
It was when we stopped for lunch.
Yeah,
so we didn't make it 4 hours.
Yeah, hiking 4 hours. We were climbing quite a lot, and we were in the middle of a dry section, so our packs had gotten weighted up, and we stopped for lunch. Right after lunch, he throws up, and I'm looking at Brigham, and we have some unspoken words of oh no, this is the last thing we need to start on day one of a big 5-day, 100+ mile trip at high elevation. And anyways, we kind of go into this, and we just saying you probably have it's elevation sickness. You know what I mean? At this point, we're at 10,000 feet probably, and done a decent amount of climbing and so on and so forth. And Brendan really didn't want to say it was elevation sickness. And so we go through that day. We get to the following night. He's still sick. We're all trying to help him out a little bit, but he doesn't get good rest, throws up throughout the night. We start the next day. He's just powering through. He's incredibly strong and mentally strong, and he just kept pushing. He's not eating very much. He's not hydration was a bigger factor. He was really struggling to drink, whereas when I was sick with it, I was able to drink okay, but I just even a couple bites of food.
He could hardly drink an ounce of water without throwing up.
Yeah. And so anyways, we go throughout that whole day, and eventually we have to call it. And I'm like, dude, we got to get you off trail. Like, you're just too sick. This is a big problem. So, but even at that point, he like wasn't sure it was elevation sickness. Didn't think it was elevation sickness. 2 days later, when he picks us up in a car, we ask him again, dude. So was it elevation sickness? I don't know. I don't think so. There's all these things, right? But if we break down the things that we do know about that situation, I think that there is something to learn. And I think me and Brigham have our thoughts on, was it elevation sickness? Was it not? I think we're both on the side that it was.
Actually, I'm not.
No, you changed.
No.
Okay.
I've not changed anything. Like, okay. So I think it's a fun discussion because
there's one other factor. He was taking Diamox.
Well, yeah.
The elevation sickness.
Right.
Which there's also some things to bring up with that.
Sure. So here's my take. So at the point where we stop and he starts throwing up, to me, there is not enough of a window of factors to tell me that that's elevation sickness. That looks like every case of somebody that's out of their element, out of shape, or something is irritating their stomach. Basically, he looked exhausted and sick. But so keep in mind, we'd maybe hiked 6 miles. We started the hike over 9,000 feet. We were not even to 11,000 feet yet. We were at like 10,000 feet. So rate of ascent, very low. He slept the night before at elevation. We were not really exerting ourselves very hard. Now, his fitness level may not have been great and may not have been ready for what we were doing. But
he had done the fast
fact
pack.
that he'd been kind of going along and doing these training things that as a company we were kind of doing and documenting. So like he's not an out of shape person by any stretch of the imagination. I would say he's in above average shape at this point. But so we start high, we're hiking a low rate of ascent, not running. He had plenty of food leading up to it, and we'd been hydrating, and so. To get elevation sickness where you're throwing up in 4 hours of hiking and only gaining 1,000 feet of elevation, to me does not indicate that's altitude sickness. I'm sure it's a possibility, but like there's an old adage that says train high, sleep low. So that means you can spend hours up at elevation training, climbing, running, but then go sleep low. And that's easier on your body. So that doesn't jive with that. And that's not like just some urban legend. That's like what the experts will say. It's common phrase in like mountaineering and stuff like that. So none of that to me is consistent with like altitude sickness. It's just too soon. Now, the reason why when he started puking and I looked over at you is because that's evacuation of everything you've eaten and all your fluids. So that's the problem. So it's kind of a two-part answer is I don't think at first what he had was altitude sickness. That's my opinion. But what happened was, and this is a tough situation because if I had a crystal ball, my crystal ball told me he's gonna get altitude sickness. He should turn around now, because all we were doing was going higher and higher and farther and stressing our body more and more and more. Yet he's losing more and more fluid, exerting himself more, stressing himself more, and gaining elevation. So that's a crash course to disaster, right? And that's what it was. So that's why, like, once he started puking, that's very, very bad because then he just kept going. But as he kept going, we're all sitting over here drinking like 2 gallons of water, and he can't keep down a half a cup. And if he drinks that much, he's throwing up. And over the day, he maybe consumed like 200 calories. And so that's where his curve of stress on the body just skyrocketed. And so for sure, by that night where we camped, kind of by that creek and into that next day, yeah, for sure, he had just took the fast train to altitude sickness by whatever happened at the beginning. So I don't think what started was altitude sickness, but by that initial starting to throw up, and he kept throwing up and not being able to hydrate his body the rest of the day, not being able to fuel his body.
And the whole next day.
And he's still hiking at an increasing elevation. We hiked like 26, 27 miles that day. So, yeah, that's why that's my take is like, no, it wasn't probably altitude sickness at beginning, but it basically that was like the jump. That was the jump start where when he got off the trail, he for sure had altitude sickness.
That's interesting. I think that's really interesting because there is one other factor. As he told us before, he had a bunch of stress going on. He wasn't getting good sleep. He wasn't doing some of those things leading into it.
Yeah, because he was like doing some finals in grad school.
Yep. There's one other thing that he brought up a lot, and that there's a little bit of research and people out there. It's one of the things that are claimed side effects of Hammocks, which Hammocks is a prescription to help avoid elevation sickness, which he was taking. Is he was saying, man, I think it was the pills. Like, I think it was the altitude sickness pills, which, funny enough, that can be one of the side effects of Hammocks is basically all the same symptoms of elevation sickness, which is really interesting. Which is also why, at least the information I got from my doctor was, don't take any of this unless you have to. And if you have to start taking it, when you start taking it, you should start descending in elevation anyways, because these are just Band-Aids on a bigger problem. That was the advice that I had been received when I got a prescription to take. But that would be interesting. Like, what if it was, say, Hammocks? This is all hypothetical at this point, right? But then that just jump-started elevation sickness, which is why it threw him through such a loop of being like, I don't know what's going on.
And like to be honest, like Brendan is not like the most. I don't think he's like the most aware of all these things. It's not to say that he's just totally ignorant of everything and doesn't know what's going on, but there's an element of that where maybe he hasn't spent a lot of time, really trying to research the effects, the signs and symptoms of altitude sickness or whatever.
It's kind of like with me, I wasn't that interested in altitude sickness till I basically got it, and then I started to educate myself a lot. Brendan has actually done a lot of things at high elevation and never had issues. So I think to this point, he wasn't tracking or caring as much. It was just like, yeah, I can just do it. It's fine. Yeah. Whereas like now with me, just one encounter, I'm like paranoid about like, all right, I need to limit all the factors all the time, because it's not fun. And it can totally ruin a trip that might be a trip of a lifetime, right? So anyways, I think that was really interesting. It's another just little story and case point. We don't actually know what happened to Brendan on that trip. We definitely have our theories, and at the point he turned around, it was irrelevant whether he had elevation sickness or not because he was dehydrated. He couldn't eat or drink, and it was irrelevant at that point. But anyways, yeah, I think there's some good takeaways from that, and hopefully there's some good takeaways from this whole podcast with just the tips of what you can and can't do. I'm a big believer in getting a device that can track heart rate, and you can track blood oxygen percentage. We didn't talk about that. I don't know how to talk about that because that's probably something I'll be adding in this year, is trying to learn a little bit more from that. But I do know, that's a big factor when you're hiking like the massive peaks, is they'll throw a finger scanner on you and be like, oh man, you're too low, we need to turn you around type of thing. So there's probably more that we could talk about on a future episode if we learn more about that side of it. But
I'd like to get like some kind of trail doctor or something in here.
Yeah.
Be able to talk about those other two altitude issues.
If you guys need some entertainment and you have Netflix, there's a documentary on there called 14 Peaks, right? And man, that is super interesting because there's this guy going and hiking basically the world's tallest 14 peaks, and he's doing it as fast as he can. And elevation's the biggest factor when you're hiking Everest and everything around it and throughout the world. There's a lot of just interesting little pieces of discussion about elevation in that documentary, but it's also just insanely well filmed and entertaining. So go watch that one.
All right. Well, is there anything else you guys want to add?
I think we should end with like takeaways for the audience. Like, what's the takeaway? And I would like to point out what the takeaway is not. And the takeaway is not to be paranoid about altitude sickness or to be afraid of it or to think that you need to mitigate all the risk, therefore just never go.
Yeah.
Please do not take that as this, like, we, as you know, what we do for a business, we definitely advocate not packing your fears and your what ifs. I think that applies to this as well. So just get experience, listen to your body, pay attention to the factors, do all the research you can, talk to a doctor. I mean, just do as much as you can to educate yourself, to prepare yourself, to just plan, but don't have this fear of that if you go into the mountains that you're going to get altitude sickness, therefore you're never going backpacking in the mountains and you're just not going to do these things because you don't have the time to sleep at the trailhead for 5 days. And like, it's just a matter of just be aware of what can happen and try to mitigate it as much as you possibly can. And statistically, you're very likely to be just fine. I know I've been in the mountains thousands and thousands of times, and there's the one time I've had altitude sickness for sure. Maybe I've had some minor symptoms before, a handful of times, but so that I hope that conveys to the audience, like, you know, we just want to help people, and getting altitude sickness sucks. We don't want that for people.
Yeah.
So we're going to help people mitigate that. But
I would second that.
Keep
for
going
sure.
out.
Yeah, I would second that for sure. Like, I've been, at or above 10,000 feet of elevation my whole life at different periods of time. And I also don't think that I've really had elevation sickness until more recently. There's times when I look back and I'm like, that could have been, but it also just could have been a number of other factors, right? But not many of those anyways, for how many times I've been at elevation totally ignorant of any of this knowledge, right? So even just having a basic knowledge of some of this will help you to mitigate it, an already low percentage chance of something happening. I think, like I say, my family essentially has been at high elevation a lot, and we've almost no one's really had factors. Obviously, you don't get to elevation and feel like $1 million like you can run, because you still got to keep up with breathing, and it limits you and slows you down naturally. So that's always going to be there. But I think as far as just actual elevation sickness, it is quite rare, and I think having a generalized piece of information like this is really helpful to just do some of those things to help eliminate it. So yeah, I second that. Don't get too nervous or fearful about it, for sure.
All right. Well, guys, if you're interested in anything that Outdoor Vitals has to sell, and you want to let us know that you listen to the podcast, please go through the links at the bottom next time you decide to go shopping for your backpacking gear. They'll be in the description. I'm sorry, not at the bottom. The description of the episode in your podcatcher that you use, iTunes, whatever, or on YouTube as well, where we have our brand new YouTube channel for the Live Ultralight podcast.
It's doing well, by the way. You've done a good job with it, Joe. It's doing
slowly
well.
slowly building. We'll see. So feel free to send us your comments, questions about backpacking, cool outdoor stories, or ideas for future episode topics. And if we think it'll bring value to our audience, we will read it out on the show. You can send them by commenting on our Live Ultralight podcast YouTube channel, like we were just saying, or you can send us an email at liveultralightpodcast@gmail.com. And if you have any positive iTunes reviews, we will also read those on the show. So please be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Hopefully you learned something with this episode. I did. Yeah, we'll see you on the trails.
We're going to get you to the top of King's Peak, Joe.
It's a thorn in my side.